Hello and welcome to another edition of ORF's book discussion. Today we will be looking at the book titled The Light That Fails, A Reckoning by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. Dr. Ivan Krastev is the chairman, Center for Liberal Strategy, Sofia, and a permanent fellow at the IWM Vienna. Professor Stephen Holmes is the Walter E. Mayer Professor of Law at New York University. I'm delighted that both the authors could join us today and extend my warmest greetings to them. I'm also very glad to welcome our two discussants for the day, Mihir Swarup Sharma, Director of the Center for Economy and Growth Program, ORF, and Nandan Unnikrishnan, who is a Distinguished Fellow at ORF, where he looks after the Eurasia program. Welcome, everyone. The format of the event will be as follows. I will first invite the two authors to make their introductory remarks, where they will each have about 7 to 8 minutes. This will be followed by our discussants, who will again have about 8 to 10 minutes each to share their thoughts about the book, after which the authors will have a chance to respond to any questions or the issues the discussants might have raised. We will then move on to a more open-ended Q&A session, and here I would like to make an announcement for our viewers. Please send us your questions via the Q&A box on your screen so that I can pose them to the authors once the initial round of remarks is over. So without further ado, let's get this discussion started. The book, The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, examines the present-day backlash against liberalism. This in-depth study of the crisis being faced by liberalism 3 decades after its apparent triumph at the end of the Cold War leads to a very original explanation of the issues that face us today, including the rise of populist parties and coming to power of leaders like Donald Trump and Viktor Orbán. The authors classify the post-Cold War period as an age of imitation and the resentment that it has generated, and then explain this concept through developments in the post-communist societies, carrying it forward to include the United States as well. Their argument also informs their understanding of what the rise of China implies for these developments, as well as the nature of power that Beijing will exercise in our world. And to understand the issues explored in the book in more detail, I now invite Dr. Ivan Krastev to make his remarks. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. I don't know, will Stephen agree, but in a certain way, we hoped that nobody is going to read our book outside of Europe and the United States. Because this is, in a way, a very Eurocentric book which takes the Cold War as the major experience of the 20th century, which means that basically we're keeping other things out. But where we started from is the following. It was 1990. This was at a high moment at the end of the Cold War, the expectations for the New World Order. And then there was a vice president of the United States who was called Dan Quayle, and who was not famous for his intellectual power, but he coined a phrase. Speaking to a big audience, he said, "The future will be better tomorrow." He obviously wanted to say that the life is going to be better tomorrow. But where we started from was that paradoxically the future was better yesterday. In 1990, at the end of the Cold War, particularly in the West and in Central Eastern Europe, there was an idea that we knew how the future is going to look like. And this was not the cartoonish view. The end of history is not kind of as irrelevant as many people have been talking about, because what Fukuyama basically captured back then was the feeling that liberal democracy is the end of the modernization journey, that liberal democracy is the synonymous with modernity, and that at the end of the day, all countries, some of them are going to do it better than others, but they're going either to try to copy, to imitate, to fake the Western model, but this was the model. Because the Cold War was a clash between two universalist ideologies, and one of them was not simply defeated. One of them resigned. So from this point of view, this is quite important. It is not that basically Soviet Union was defeated militarily. It was the Soviet leaders themselves that basically said our claim on the future did not work. And we're making a very strong point to try to understand why for some of these leaders, it was easier to agree that it was liberal democracy, the final destination of history, than to agree that history does not have a final destination. But after saying this, we decided if this was the frame, what happened and why? Basically, 20, 25 years later, we see a major backlash. Basically, liberalism was attacked both from outside and from inside, where it comes from. And while to talk about populism, the rise of populism, have been explained very much. We have a lot of interesting studies about the economic and the cultural reasons for this. Most of these cases have been taken in their particularity. There was a lot of writing about what went wrong with Eastern Europe. What is the problem in the United States? But for us, the idea of the age of imitation is allowing to put together many of these cases. And I'm going to focus particularly on the case of Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and leaving the United States much more for Stephen. But one of our major story was that in a certain way, Fukuyama was right. Imitation was very important for this Cold War period. And Eastern Europe, from this point of view, was a critically important paradigmatical case, because imitation is not like imposition. From this point of view, when people basically try to describe what happened in Eastern Europe in the terms of post-colonial studies, they're wrong. East European societies wanted to be like the West. In a certain way, we believe that this was our kind of a true identity, which was deprived of us during the communist period, in which most of East European countries was defined as Soviet occupation. What then went wrong? Why countries like Poland, Hungary, that have been praised just 10 years ago as the models for democracy, countries that basically are telling us how the world is going to look like in the future, why they became now the posters for this kind of illiberal trends? And normally, when people talking about Central and Eastern Europe, you have two classical explanations. One is economical, and they're basically going to say, listen, what you're seeing is the mobilization of the losers of the economic reforms. So it's very much about neoliberalism only. And this works for some countries, but paradoxically, the country for which it does not work is Poland. For the last 30 years, Poland was the fastest growing European economy. Even more, the social inequality has declined in the last 10 years. And if you go on the opinion polls, you're going to see this same Poland that looks so resentful and angry. More than 70% of the population continuously repeat that they're very much satisfied with their life. So why basically, if this is the case, if it's not economy, what it is? And the second explanation was cultural. Basically, Central and East Europeans basically go back where they were. I hate particularly the idea of the backsliding, which is very popular in the democratization literature, because it comes from religious literature of the 16th century, where backsliding was when newly converted Jews went back to their bad practices. So this type of a missionary rhetoric behind it. We discovered something slightly more important and slightly different. And using also René Girard and some of his kind of insights about imitation, we basically discovered a very contradictory nature of the process of political imitation. Imitation is something. It was around always. This is the way we are building identities, the way we develop. But if I want to be like you, there are four important issues coming. First, if I want to be like you, I acknowledge that you're better than me. So then what is wrong with me? Secondly, if I want to be like you, probably I want not simply to be like you because I want to be like you, but because I want to defeat you, because basically I want to take the power that you have. And thirdly, which in my view is also extremely important, if I want to be like you, how easy it is if you're changing all the time. And from this point of view, imitating Christ and imitating your peers is a slightly different game. And this is why we have been looking at the rhetoric of illiberal leaders like Mr. Orbán or Mr. Kaczynski. We basically figured out that resentment towards imitation was critically important in the way that they're building their legitimacy with their voters. The story was, we don't want to be Germans. We don't want to be like French. We want to be ourselves. While this is not a new motive in political history, There was one very important difference about East European revolutions, which at least I do believe we managed to underline. Listen, during the revolutions, always somebody is leaving the country, immigrating, but normally this is the defeated party. After the Bolshevik revolutions, it was the White Russians that left. One of the paradoxes of 1989 was that after the success of the liberal revolutions, it was the liberals who first left their countries. Because in a very important way, if the future of Poland is Germany, why I should wait while Poland is going to become Germany when I can simply go to Germany? And opening of the borders was so important, and this explains the fact that one of the reality of the post-1989 world, which very few people recognized, was that East European countries was not simply very much aging and shrinking in demographic terms, but there was around 10-15% of their population, because also of out-migration. And this created this very strange tension in which the West was the best because we want to be like it. But at the same time, the West was a threat because, as one old Bulgarian lady told me, Europe is taking out our kids and our doctors. So this created a very specific story of a typical type of a nationalism and nationalistic resentment, which is very different than one we know from the 19th century. And also when we go to the case of Russia, and I'm sure that Stephen is also going to say much more than it, in the case of Russia in the beginning, basically, this was the same idea. We want to be like the West, but this was also the realization that it is going to be very difficult for Russia to become like the West. At a certain point, imitating the others can be weaponized and basically can be the way to delegitimize and to destroy the model without coming any alternative. And from this point of view, we're very much interpreting some of the foreign policy of President Putin saying, you wanted to imitate you? Okay, but we're going to imitate the real West. And the real West is not the West that you're telling us about. The real West is aggressive American foreign policy here and there. And this is why, for us, one of the moments to try to basically show this kind of a weaponization of imitation as the way basically to fight the model was this critical question, why President Putin basically decided to lie to international communities that there was no Russian special forces in Crimea in 2014, which was very clear that just 1 week later, everybody knows the names of the people that were there. But in a certain way, you're not lying because you believe that you can hide the truth. You're lying to be called a liar. And when you're going to be called a liar, your response is, so what? And secondly, liar like you. What about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and so on and so on? And basically presenting from this point of view the imitation as the major kind of a frame through which we can put together such a very different cases like Poland, like Hungary, like Russia. We went to the United States and then the question was, but how it happened that even the model, those that have been imitated, became resentful to the world that was trying to imitate them. But then I'm going to go to Stephen because I do believe he's going to give much more compelling answer to this question than me.
Thank you, Dr. Krastev. Professor Holmes, over to you for your comments.
Right. Excellent. So again, repeating what Ivan said, thank you very much for having us here. I want to start by reflecting a little upon Ivan's point that we were bracketing the rest of the world, which is true in the sense of what we didn't cover many cases of populist, authoritarian, xenophobic, anti-liberalism in the world, for example, in Brazil, and some say in India and other places. But we were conscious that there was a kind of a general crisis of the liberal democratic idea in the world. And our project was not global, but to try to find a way of connecting various quite distinct emanations or expressions of this anti-liberal zeitgeist, the US, Central Europe, and Russia, and to try to find a way to talk about them together. And we found this, what Ivan has very clearly described as this Ariadne's thread of imitation, as a way of telling a story that shows that did reflect our sense, and I think a general sense, that there's a global movement going on, and the connections are not particularly obvious. It's gone so far. I mean, and just to start to say a word about the United States, and then I'll come to that at the end of my remarks. We have now in the United States an explicitly anti-democratic political party. One of our two political parties is explicitly anti-democratic, which creates a problem for President Biden, who is trying to stand for democracy around the world. And he's got an opponent. He's got an opponent party. The other party is denying that the election is legitimate, since the main principle of democracy is the capacity for a free and fair election to be held and incumbents to be voted out and have an exchange of regime without the losers being in any way punished. So this kind of and not put in jail and so forth. There's a radical change in the United States today, with accusations on both sides that the other party is treasonous. And that's, of course, if to the extent that lasts, that's the end of democracy. So this is a very deep story. Now, just kind of to repeat on, re-emphasize some of Ivan's points. We thought at the very beginning, both of us in 1989, that the end of the Cold War meant the kind of the success of the liberal model, the failure of an alternative, well, along with Fukuyama, the failure of an alternative communist model. And it's not that every country was going to become a liberal democracy, but that the idea, that was Fukuyama's claim, that the liberal democratic ideal was going to be really unchallengeable. There was going to be nothing arising which would replace it. And then it turned out, to our, in a way, surprise, that a period of liberal hegemony, that is the idea that liberalism is the only system worth imitating, created a lot of resentment. Because, as Ivan said, to say that you must all become like us is interpreted by many people around the world as insulting and provocative. So that we realized, it was a kind of a late realization, that democratization was a project of imitation, and liberalization was a product of imitation, which means superiors and inferiors. And because of contextual matters, if you take a fully worked out political system and transfer it into a country that has a very different history, you are going to be performing a very an experiment with very unpredictable results. So just a couple of examples. One very salient one for us was that in Hungary, which was a country that had no private property, if you try to implement in Hungary Thatcherite privatization, what's going to happen is that the directors of the enterprises are going to use the assets of the enterprise to put all the resources of the company, which was a part of the country's public patrimony, in their own pockets. And this creates a lot of tension in a society, because you can have two friends who were both lived in the same way under communism, and within a couple of years, one is driving around in his Rolls Royce and the other can't afford a bus ticket, and one is dining in fish restaurants every night and the other can't afford fresh fruit. This is creating a violent and unjustifiable inequality by a form of privatization, which in the West was a rather minor part of the economic system. But of course, in Hungary, this was a major complete upturning of the social world. Plus the fact, and I think this is, of course, an essential point for us, that the liberal categories which describe freedom and lack of freedom did not in any way capture the experience of post-communist society. So, for example, the category of individual rights does not capture the abuse that occurred when a few people privatized the public patrimony of the country. Because public patrimony, when I take the public patrimony and enrich myself with it, I'm not violating anyone's individual rights. I'm violating a natural resource of the country. And so the category individual rights, not only did it not capture that offense, but it also, in a sense, the category of individual rights blessed the offense by saying it's my private property, those who stole in this kleptocratic system the wealth of the country. And then again, just another example Ivan already mentioned, in 1989, the highest kind of freedom was the freedom to leave your country. And this was individualism and the freedom to go, say, to Berlin. If you're a doctor, go to Berlin and practice your profession. But today, when so much talent throughout Central and Eastern Europe has left for the West, there's a feeling that these countries are bleeding together, that they're demographically shrinking, and individualism, which means leaving behind your country, abandoning the country that invested in you, is viewed as there's something wrong with it. I mean, it does. You can't say, oh, my right as a Hungarian doctor trained in Hungary to go to Berlin and set up and take care of my family and to live a good life and be a good doctor, because I can be a much better doctor in Berlin than in Budapest, given my assets. That's individual freedom in a way, but there's no way you're going to convince Hungarians that that's the highest form of freedom. There's a disturbance there that's produced. This is something we didn't really grasp in 1989, when we were more or less, I wouldn't say euphoric, because it was a time of danger and time of definitely radical change, which no one really understood. But we didn't really see how this change could produce this xenophobic, nationalist, nativist backlash. And then I'll just say, of course, and so we talk about various cases, but the US case is particular because while in Eastern and Central Europe, being a copy is viewed as as something you resent. So there's a nice phrase in German, which is the besser Wessi. You have a German word besser wissen, which means a guy knows better. And a Wessi is a Westerner. A besser Wessi is the Westerner who knows better, looks down upon you, tells you that you're inferior. And there's a sense of the Eastern Germans, for example, and all of Eastern Europe, we want to get rid of those know-it-alls, the people who know better than we do. But it's also so the sense was, more can be said about this, the sense was that the imitator resented the imitated. But in the US, starting with Trump in the 1980s, during the Cold War, Trump never really talked about the communist threat. He was obsessed with the fact that the United States, he claimed, had beaten the Germans and the Japanese in World War II. And he was upset that the American strategy after World War II was to prevent the remilitarization of German and Japanese nationalism. And instead, the project was to channel German and Japanese nationalism into export-led industrialization, industrial productivity. And that, of course, meant that we were going to buy their cars and their other products. But that was better than giving them nuclear weapons, for example. It was thought in 1945, something that Trump denied completely and thought, no, they're imitating us. They're doing better than us. They're selling cars. We resent them. And this idea of resenting those who imitate you, in Trump's mind, started long before he was president. But then, as of course, with the rise of China, has become a platform in which you can definitely galvanize political support, which he has done. So the role of China in the Trump world has been that it was able to attract support both from workers and from industry, because the workers resented the fact, and of course India plays a role here too. China represented stealing American jobs, and for the business and for the industrial community, China represented stealing job-killing robots, which seemed like a paradox, and it's a very fragile alliance. But that idea that the U.S. suffers from being imitated and also suffers from being a magnet. So Trump was the first president in American history who has said, we're not exceptional, we're not a model, people shouldn't come here, there's nothing moral, there's nothing morally superior about America, and the desire of the world to be like America and then to come to America is the worst thing about America. And that's which has had this result that I began with, of producing a political party which is explicitly opposed to the fundamental norms of democracy. Something we have just begun to understand. And I think Ivan would agree that our book is a probing analysis. It's certainly not the last word on the subject, but it's meant to kind of open a discussion about the causal factors leading to these various forms of anti-liberalism that are proliferating everywhere.
Thank you, Professor Holmes. If I can take off from what you just said about how you try to understand the causal implications of what's going on, there's a point where you say that the age of liberal imitation is over, but the age of illiberal imitation may have just begun. So what does this mean for the post-communist societies that you discuss in the book? Because you also suggest that, say, some of the actions of Russia, in terms of its own sarcastic imitation, they are no long-term strategy. So if these societies were just imitating a model in the past and that model no longer holds, then what is their identity and what does it mean for their future? If you could answer that question, either of you could take up, and one after the other, I guess.
Listen, this is a great question, and in a certain way, part of the strength and the weakness of the liberal regimes is that they're very strong on the negative side. It's a great mobilization of a different type of resentment. But at the same time, basically, even when they start to imitate each other, they're imitating each other much more in a way a parrot is imitating a human voice. In a certain way, they cannot produce a sentence. And this is quite important because you're imitating government techniques and so on, but your major source of legitimacy comes from your authenticity and your originality. And part of the problem, particularly really major distinctions between Western Europe and Eastern Europe and the problem of democratization, because many people are asking us why this type of imitation worked in West Germany and didn't work in East Germany. The major difference is that in 1945, after the defeated war, about everything basically being set, in Western Europe, there was a kind of a realization that nationalism was defeated. They lost. This was not 1989. Paradoxically, 1989 was a joint victory of liberals and nationalists. It was very much about sovereignty of East European states. It's enough to look basically at solidarity leadership that you're going to see that you have liberals like Geremek and Michnik, but Kaczynskis were there, and they didn't change their views for the last 30 years. So the question for us was why, in the beginning, nationalism was muted and then became so strongly hurt. And they, at least in our view, two important things to explain. One of the things that is very much neglected in our analysis, particularly of the 1990s, was the effect of the Yugoslav wars. In Europe, the Yugoslav wars came, and because nationalism was very much personified by ex-communists like Milosevic and others, anti-communist nationalists like Kaczynskis, they cannot identify. So for 10 years, also for security reasons, for sovereignty reasons, joining NATO, joining the European Union was the joint goal of both liberals and nationalists. But then something important happened. All the time, the imitation was there, and of course European integration was a very institutional form of imitation in a very literal sense. Many people on the conservative right had the feeling that they are not imitating the model that they have been buying or imagining in 1990. Listen, in 1990, if you're a conservative Pole, what you like about the West is that this is societies that like God, they go to church, they hate communism, they're anti-leftist. So it was very much in love with the Cold War West. But the Cold War West, in a certain way, disappeared with the end of the Cold War. And 20, 25 years later, you see kind of the ideas that were coming of the West was not particularly the ideas of people running to the church. Of course, there were many ideas that basically these conservative poles didn't like. So suddenly, and this is your story, most of these people are starting to claim that they present the real West, the West that was betrayed by the West. And you have this also, particularly a decade ago in the discourse of the Russian leaders. They're saying liberalism, like communism, is a distortion of the tradition of the West. We're staying for the real West. We're staying for the nation states. We're staying for traditional Christianity and others. The new development, and this is interesting when you see what is the future of these illiberal parties. There was a moment in which they believed that they're a global movement, and this was the Trump moment. Because Trump has one effect on the United States, but it was basically totally different effect on the rest of the world. Because before Trump coming to power, most of these illiberal leaders, they had the feeling of a guerrilla leaders that have their kind of a distant wars around the type of history. And then suddenly, basically, Trump came to power, and you are not a guerrilla leader anymore. You are the history itself. You have the feeling that history has changed course. And this is why, basically, this was a totally different understanding of what is going on. Trump's defeat in the United States, but also kind of many different stories that was happening, created a common media space on which this type of a populist movement functions. They're going to borrow ideas, they're going to use certain attacks here and there, but they're more and more becoming kind of a localized in the way they're operating. And one of the interesting stories about Central and Eastern Europe is that we are moving for something that I'm going to call post-populist Central and Eastern Europe, because they're electoral cycles. And if you manage to allow competitive politics to survive, at some point you're going to lose the elections. People want change. And from time to time, even people don't know exactly how the change would look like, but they want change. And this is interesting to see, and I'm just going to make this last point. Some of this post-populist change can bring liberal changes that many of the people are going to be surprised by. And here is my argument. For example, Polish society, the most Catholic society in Europe, quite traditionalist, particularly when it comes to sexual minority, to this type of cultural values. So there was a conservative consensus in Poland, which was very much shared both by the right, by center-right, by center-left. It was very much embodied in a kind of a compromise over the abortion law. It was about marginalizing any issues concerning gay rights and others. And then comes the current governing party and then weaponized this traditional consensus. They made this the heart. Basically, they said that in a certain way, all this LGBT ideology is worse than communism. They decided to fight it. But as a result of it, because it's also politically very polarized society, what is happening is that 20-30% of the population, which normally was not very much supportive for this type of gay rights and others, because for them the major dividing line is the opposition to the government, they're never going to attack these rights anymore. Because for them, attacking them means that they are going to get identity as being supporters of the opposition. And I do believe this kind of a change of political identities that are going to come are going to be there. So this is going, at least for Central and Eastern Europe, I do believe it's going to be a really very interesting and to a certain extent, not one direction change of political identities and others. Because Eastern Europe for the last 25 years has a very liberal consensus on the surface and quite a lot of traditionalist consensus behind the surface. And now both of them has collapsed. What has collapsed basically was the liberal cover, but what is very much also kind of question is this type of a deep conservatism, which was present there, which was very much present there. And the more polarized political society is, the more basically this consensus cannot survive.
Yeah, so just a few elaborations. One, populism produces its own disappointments. The fact that it has flourished in some places doesn't mean it's going to last. And nothing we said should imply that. and there are a lot of reactions to it, but it may collapse just from the fact that it doesn't really promise that much. Certainly not the young people. And I think what Ivan was just saying about tradition does reflect the power of generational change, obviously. On the difference between 1945 and 1989, of course, the West was different. The United States was very different. In 1945, the U.S., the consensus of liberalism in the U.S. was a kind of New Deal Keynesian liberalism, social compact liberalism. While in 89, the Western, you had a Reaganite, Thatcherite idea in which basically there is no such thing as too much inequality in society, which is a very radical idea and which doesn't confront the politically destabilizing consequences of economic inequality. So that's a part of the answer to why there was more of a success, because, and of course, the U.S. was really invested in West Germany's becoming a liberal democracy, partly because we didn't want Nazism to rise again, but also because the Soviet Union was there, and there was a big investment in not wanting German workers to be seduced by communism. So therefore, Mitbestimmung and other forms of economic, New Deal forms of worker participation and so on were built into the system. About Russia, you asked a question about Russia's, oh, okay, I'm very sorry. Ivan, would you talk here while I answer this?
Listen, when we basically going back to Russia, I also want just in 2 minutes to tell you why China ended up in our book. And keep in mind, both of us have been doing work on Eastern Europe and Russia. Of course, Stephen has been doing work on the United States, but none of us is a China expert. But for us, something extremely important. China never was part of the Age of Imitation. China was borrowing, never imitating. In a certain way, insistence that they never imitate was at the core legitimacy of the Chinese communist regime. And I do believe from this point of view, it was quite interesting. And basically, we look around and we ask ourselves then how relevant all comparisons with the Cold War are now when we see a rising kind of a competition, particularly between the United States and China. And without being basically specialist on China, we had 3 simple points to make. One is that paradoxically, China on its own history knows the dark side of imitation too. Once, because for a while they have been imitating the Soviets and it ended up not badly, not nicely. But secondly, Maoism was aggressively trying to export itself to the world in the 1960s, particularly in the Third World. Maoism was much more aggressive than the Soviets at this period. And they know that basically any type of a missionary political ideological behavior produces resentment. You get converts, but you get also enemies. So strangely enough, what China was trying to do is trying to dominate the world, to create asymmetrical relationships. But it was not anymore trying to make others like them. And from this point of view, part of it comes on one level from their complex of superiority, that their regime is so complex that only Chinese can handle it. But on the other, unlike the communism, unlike liberalism, Chinese position is not a universalist proposal. It does not want to transform the world. And we ended up here, and basically for us, and this is why also what Stephen was saying for the United States, we see, listen, we're going to post-Cold War period in a different sense than the one that we believed in 1990. This is the end of understanding international politics as clash between 2 universalist ideologies. We are going to see much more fragmentation. We're going to see much more competition. It could be quite nasty, but this is a different world. And while many have been accusing us, oh, you're too pessimistic or not, honestly, we're not, because what is common between pessimists and optimists is that both believe that they know how the future is going to look like. We don't have this certainty that we know. And this is from where the title of our book comes. Because The Light That Failed is the title of the first novel that Kipling wrote. And this is not the greatest novel, but what is interesting about it, that it has 2 different versions. His mother asked him to write a book which is brief and with a happy end. And then he wrote a longer version which didn't end happily. because our publishers are not going to give us an opportunity to have two versions of the book, briefer with happy end and one which is much more prolonged and much more pessimistic. We decided at least to use the title of the Kipling's books to say, listen, we believe that future is the invasion of the open, of the unknown. We don't believe that liberalism is going to disappear in the way the Russian president predicted when he said that liberalism is oblivious. From this point of view, what is disappearing is the liberal hegemony in the world. But from a certain point of view, the liberal hegemony in the world was one of the major risks that liberalism is facing itself.
Thank you so much. I will now invite the discussants to talk us through their thoughts and impressions about the book. Let's start with Mihir. Over to you, sir. You have about 7 to 8 minutes.
Right. I hope I'm audible and visible and all this other stuff. Right. So thank you all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to read this book, because I found it tremendously enlightening. Broadly, I would summarize this book's thesis as the way that I saw it, as an explanation of what the authors have called the Age of Imitation that took hold after 1989, and as well as a sort of suggestion that it might be coming to an end. And the Age of Imitation consisted of countries across the world imitating the West, either imitating the West's ends of political liberalism, as in Central Europe, or its means of economic growth, as in the People's Republic of China, or the appearances of democracy, as in Russia for the first couple of decades after the end of the Soviet Union. Now, I have to say, before I move on to some other things, I just want to contest this. This is wrong. All right, it gives the impression that liberal democratic institutions are somehow Western. Now, I'm glad you called yourself out for Eurocentrism to begin with, so I don't have to do that now. But from the point of view of not just an Indian, somebody living in the world's largest democracy, but as somebody who imagines himself as a liberal within that country, the notion that denying that liberal democracy is universal rather than Western is already giving in uncontested to a live argument in the rest of the world. You know, the idea that universal values do not include the values that you have here identified as Western is not a closed argument. And I just want to highlight that. And so in India, I think you could say that we created our liberal democracy, yes, consciously as part of an Enlightenment tradition, but we've also thought to root it in Indian practices. And I think that across the political spectrum in India today, if you told them that democracy, the trappings of liberal democracy were Western rather than Indian, you would receive very, very strong pushback. So, a theory of imitation that doesn't take into account the world's largest democracy is not a theory that I think one should be satisfied with. Right, now, going further on, I think the other question that I must raise early on is that the notion of liberalism, and it could mean in daily conversation, and even as the way politicians use it, any and all of democratic practices, including electoralism, personal liberalism, tolerance of difference, institutional or constitutional liberalism, the individualist ethic. Now, in some sense, if one doesn't sort of make a clear effort to unpack this to begin with, this can lead to some confusion when it comes to discussing occasions when one of those aspects is prioritized or even valorized and others are discounted. And I say this with the idea in my head, again, of India, because a majoritarian state, whether Hungary or India, in which liberal constraints on state power are dismantled, is that truly illiberal if it retains a commitment to electoralism? And I'm not just saying this out of nowhere. I'm saying this because there are those who would dismantle those institutional structures, but yet would say that because of our commitment to electoral democracy or to the belief in majority rule, we are the true liberals and others are not. And to the extent that Orbán denies liberalism's hold over Hungary, I think he may, I mean, he may not be the rule. In India, again, many liberal leaders claim to be the true liberals, writing the hypocrisy or inaccuracies of liberalism past. In India, for example, public secularism is constantly subject to this attack, with religious nationalists viewing toleration or the protection of minority identities as, the Indian word is pseudo-secular and thus pseudo-liberal. And, if you spend time online in India, the sight of liberal in a Twitter bio means with 99% certainty that the person behind the account is in fact an illiberal politically. Right. So again, there's a lot here to unpack. So I want to compliment you on your discussion of CEE and of Russia in particular, because a lot of it was not just informative but illuminating. And the placement about the panic about immigration, or I think gender identity as psychological displacement in demographically shrinking countries was, I think, really, really very useful to somebody who's looking at these societies from outside. I have to say, it's really the opposite here. I think that as any Indian will certify, non-resident Indians, or NRIs that we call them, are the biggest hyper-nationalists we have. All right, and politically, in fact, some of the most influential ideologically, in that in our drift away from our old notions of liberal democracy back in the 80s or 90s to what we have today, which is an increasingly illiberal democracy, it was the people who left who, in fact, were at the center of this transformation. So it's an interesting sort of counterpoint to your description of Central Europe, and that's why I found it very interesting. On Russia, I want to ask a question rather than challenging you. You say that until 2011, 2012, it imitated the West deceptively, basically the way I read it, in order to get the West off its back. And today it has shifted to challenge, for example, in Crimea, as a mechanism of domestic legitimation of the regime. Now, when I see, and as somebody who doesn't know Russia as well as, for example, Nandan does, when I see what is happening to Alexei Navalny, I see a state, or many other dissidents in the past, I see a state that continues to want to claim that it operates just as well and as justly as its competitors in the West. So Navalny, the way I see it, they argue, is not in jail because he is a disruptor. In China, if Navalny was in jail, they'd outright say he's a disruptor, right? And that's why he's in jail. But he is in jail, according to the Kremlin, because he broke legitimate laws in the process of, or unrelated to, but in the process of his political activities. And it is important to the Kremlin, it appears to me, that the Russian people share this view. Now, this seems to be different. This doesn't seem to me that they've given up on this notion of imitation. So I wanted to question that rather than anything else. See what your answer would be. And finally, you claim that the age of imitation has ended because the PRC is not interested in continuing an ideological battle. It is gone from a stage of post-Enlightenment competition, from an Enlightenment competition over ideology to a post-Enlightenment competition over resources or for strategic advantage. Now, I think that the reason that this is incomplete, if not wrong, is that it fails to understand how empire works. And you say that China today in Africa, for example, is not seeking to impose Confucian notions or Xi Jinping thought, or to convert the population. But that's not how empires work. Empires don't convert populations necessarily. They buy off elites. They create a collaborator class. The notion, again, that Xi does not have a vision for humanity's future is questionable, because a vision of a China-centric world is a vision for humanity's future. The Roman Empire had a vision for humanity's future. And by denying that imperialism is in itself an ideology, and one that is fundamentally in conflict and historically in conflict with liberal cosmopolitanism, you're flying in the face of several centuries of history. So the age of imitation is not over. You merely have a China that is imitating another aspect of the West, imperialism, and not of liberal democracy. And I think I just want to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mihir. You have raised a lot of questions. So what I'll do is I will first invite Mr. Krishnan to make his remarks, and then the authors can respond to the issues that both the discussants raised together. Nandan sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nivedita. Thank you so much. And many thanks to the authors for agreeing to participate in this discussion and talk to us about the journey they had while writing this book. I, for one, enjoyed the book for the simple reason that a lot of stray thoughts, a lot of stray ideas that were floating in my head, this book kind of put into, gave me a workable framework. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best framework, but at this point of time, there is a framework within which I can operate and understand what happened in that period of time. And it gives me a vocabulary, an academic vocabulary, that is also usable. So in that sense, I am genuinely grateful to the authors for this book. I also tend to agree with a lot of what is written in the book, not because I'm in any sense a great academic or a great amount of knowledge, but I happen to be a journalist in Moscow from 91 to 95. And, this was the period I was going to Moscow from actually 89, but permanently from 91 to 95. And I saw much of what you're describing in the book. And I definitely agree that the shock therapy that came through created such an enormous backlash that the entire goodwill that did exist towards what you call the liberal model, but I would say the United States, not necessarily the Western model, did get dissipated. The other thing I would like to stress here is that part of the reasons, and I think Ivan in his remarks did touch upon it, but part of the reason why in Central and Eastern Europe you had the nationalists and the liberals sort of in a coalition soon after the collapse was also because they were getting rid of Russian hegemony. If you remember what was going on, there was universal hatred. I mean, just to give you a small vignette, there used to be a joke in Russia that as Brezhnev traveled through Europe, somebody kissed his hand when he put it out of the train, and they said, "Oh, this must be East Germany." And then when he was traveling further, somebody spat on his hand, and he pulled it in and said, "Oh, this must be Poland." So, the resentments were very clear, and this was there. This is not an exact rendition of the joke, but just a summary. So my point here is that I like the idea of the imitations, and particularly I like the distinction that you make of the imitations of the means and goals. So, that some countries, particularly Russia, for example, is imitating some of the means primarily to discredit maybe some of the goals is fine. But I have, and we are running out of time, so therefore I just want to pose a question to which I'll have to give a little bit of background, so be tolerant, liberal with my time, as it were. I want to understand one thing. You declared the end of communism in 1990. But one question that I have is very simple. Is China capitalist or socialist in the classical definition? Why I'm asking this is very, very simple. Yes, they imitated the means, but so did, if you go back to Lenin, the new economic policy, the NEP. It was taking certain means to achieve certain ends, which were completely at dissonance with the original ends of those means are. So Deng Xiaoping, in my opinion, could be possibly doing or started possibly the same process. Now, this in communist jargon or Communist Party jargon is keeping politics in command. So, do you think that politics is still in command in China? Because it's clearly not communist politics that is command in Russia. So, Russia, we understand, is an authoritarian capitalist system. But I have a problem with China for a different reason, because classical Marxists call the base. The base seems to be functioning at a capitalist more as a capitalist model, but the superstructure seems to run a socialist, or if you want, a communist model. So this is just a question I have for the authors. And the final point I would like to make is that I'm glad you make the distinction that you primarily write about the backlash of illiberal ideas in Europe. Because if you look at India, yes, there is a backlash, and some of what you have written about applies probably to India too. But some things that don't work, for example, what works in Hungary definitely don't work in India, is because there is a distinct overlay of religion over majoritarianism. So the combination of two brings a completely different animal to the table. And I must say that while Mihir and I definitely share a liberal disposition, we may be even described as right-wing liberals, but I think I disagree with him on the importance of elections, and primarily because I see elections held in Russia. And yes, Putin is undoubtedly popular, and yes, he would be elected. But does that mean that there is any semblance of democracy there? No, definitely not. And vice versa, I see a popular leader elected in India twice in a row with a majority. But does that necessarily mean that democracy is flourishing in India? I think even Mihir will agree with me that that is not necessarily so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I request Professor Holmes to now respond to the discussants?
Yes, I'm going to have to do that very briefly because I had planned at 3:00 to had something else I have to do. So, but thank you. This was these comments were fascinating, and I do think we both, Ivan and I, accept the principle that the primary feature of world politics is plurality, diversity. It's impossible to shoehorn everything into one kind of framework. We certainly didn't intend to do that. And our concept of imitation is meant to be flexible and workable and only to be judged by its fruitfulness, where it can explain something and where it can lead you down a path. And I think if you read the book, you'll see that each page is full of details and insights of various kinds. And the fruit of the category is in the analysis of the particularity. And of course, as a general thesis, it can't be correct. I mean, it's like as an explanation for everything that happened. We didn't raise it as an explanation. We raised it as a flexible category that can take us into various rooms of the palace of world history. I think something of this is a key, which is very flexible, that can take you in many places to examine the plurality of what we nevertheless do feel has a certain kind of, there is a way in which there is a global connectedness that we're all living through, example, right now, that we want to. So I think we get many of the points we can agree upon, and is imperialism, are the Chinese imitating Western style imperialism? I don't really think that's quite accurate, but in any case, it's debatable. So all of these comments are very suggestive, and I'm going to have to leave the rest of the commentary to Ivan because I have to sign off. Unless you're going to be talking, I mean, I have something I have to do. If you're still talking in 10 minutes, I may be back, but otherwise, Ivan, I leave this to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Listen, it's not easy to be left to answer. Not simply very interesting question, but when I said in the beginning that we knew that it is a very Eurocentric book, we knew it also for one very important reason. where Europe, including Russia, is very different than anything else after 1989 is that the relations between democracy and sovereignty keep being questioned in a different way. European Union and all these East European countries basically have been joining the European Union. The idea of democracy was divorced from the idea of the sovereignty. This is the biggest exceptional nature of the European experience. And of course, this was also the biggest challenge that Russia was facing. Because there is one interesting thing. In a certain way, European Union after the end of the Cold War and Russia, both of them have been a newly born states. I mean, newly born projects. And from this point of view, when you go and say to what extent basically President Putin still believes that he is imitating the West, I don't believe this, because I do believe that he basically makes sovereignty and not democracy the center of his understanding of the world. And sovereignty, in Putin's view, is not a right, it is capacity. Political, military, cultural. So from this point of view, not everybody can be sovereign. India could be, Bulgaria could not be. And it's not because of cultural inferiority, but basically because no capacity there. So as a result of it, and I was talking to our common friend Fyodor Volkyanov recently, and he made a point which I found very revealing about Russia. He said, never in history a superpower has lost its status and influence in the world as rapidly as Russia, post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s. In 1991, Soviet Union and the United States have been co-chairing the Middle East process. In 1992, 1993, basically the Russian foreign policy basically was about asking money from the International Monetary Fund. So as a result of it, restoring Russia's relevance and influence became the super kind of a goal of the Russian foreign policy. So many things that we're asking, do they doing because of ideological reasons and others? No, it was regaining status. And in a certain way, they managed to regain it after Syria in 2015. But now comes the story, so you are on the stage, what next? And I find this very interesting because this focus on sovereignty, and particularly understanding sovereignty as self-sufficiency in a globalized world, puts you in a difficult situation. And then comes the story of China. And as I told you, I don't feel very secure speaking about China. I don't have a sense of China. I could be very wrong on Central and Eastern Europe. I could be wrong on Russia, but at least I have the feeling that I have a sense. But for me, the interesting story is Branko Milanovic wrote a good book, which is called Capitalism Alone. And he's interpreting communist period in China, by the way, communist periods only in the global south, as a specific transition to capitalism. Because this idea of the state capitalism, the idea this time of capitalism and sovereignty being married. And what I find a difference, and I'll stop on this, for me, communism was always a transformative ideology. Unlike the populists, communists didn't like the people in the way they were, but in the way they could become. You can like or dislike their project, but it was a project of changing society. And this is why the consumer was very unwelcoming to the Soviet project. Because you're trying to remake the people. You're not simply trying to keep power. I don't see this in China in the way I was seeing there, for example, in the classical communist projects. It does not mean that there is no ideology, but I see much more China as nationalist superpower that speaks Marxist jargon. But it's much more classical, hegemonic, nationalistic aspirations which is behind this than this idea to transform others. And from this point of view, it's one thing to try to corrupt the elites. It's totally different to try to change the population. Soviet Union was not simply corrupting the elites. It was a kind of a visionary part of it. So here it is, but as I told you, the more you're asking me on China, the more nervous I become.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krastev. And I do understand that there are still several issues that we could keep discussing, but we are already past the 1 hour mark that is slotted for this discussion. So thank you so much, Dr. Krastev, Mr. Unikrishnan, Mr. Sharma, for joining us. Thank you so much, also to all our viewers for tuning in to this discussion. Please stay safe and goodbye.